Good evening, time traveler. Get comfortable, take a deep breath, and prepare for a journey that will completely change how you think about one of the world's most iconic archaeological sites. Tonight, we're going to experience what it was really like to live in Machu Picchu, the legendary Incan city perched high in the Andes Mountains. But forget the romantic images of mystical mountaintop retreats and spiritual sanctuaries bathed in morning mist. That's not our story tonight. Our journey takes us to 15th century Peru, sometime between 1450 and 1470 CE, when the Inca Empire was at its height and Machu Picchu was a living, working city rather than a tourist destination. This isn't the version you see in travel brochures where visitors marvel at perfectly fitted stones and dramatic vistas. This is the reality. The crushing physical labor at 8,000 feet elevation, the constant threat of terraced agriculture failing and causing starvation, the religious obligations that demanded human sacrifice, and the understanding that you lived in an empire that could draft you for labor service at any moment without your consent. Before we begin, leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. And if there's another historical topic you'd like me to explore, let me know. Your suggestions shape these journeys. Now, let's climb the steep mountain paths to Machu Picchu and discover what life was really like in the city, in the clouds. Your journey to Machu Picchu probably didn't begin with choice. It began with mita, the Incan system of mandatory labor service. The Inca Empire didn't use money or allow private property in the way we understand it today. Instead, the state owned everything and extracted labor from its subjects through mita, a rotating draft system where able-bodied adults owed the state a certain amount of work each year. If the empire decided to build a royal estate high in the mountains and you were selected for mita service, you went. There was no opting out, no paying someone else to go in your place, no appealing the decision. It was like being drafted for military service, except the service was construction, agriculture, or whatever labor the empire needed. The construction of Machu Picchu itself was an engineering achievement that modern engineers still struggle to fully explain. It was achieved through brutal physical labor by thousands of mita workers. Massive stones, some weighing many tons, had to be quarried, shaped with bronze and stone tools, and hauled up steep mountain paths without wheels, draft animals, or pulleys. The precision stone fitting that tourists admire today, where blocks fit together so tightly you can't fit a knife blade between them, was achieved through patient grinding and fitting, trial and error, repeated thousands of times. It was craftsmanship born of unlimited labor and complete indifference to the cost and human suffering. If you were one of the permanent residents of Machu Picchu, rather than a construction worker, you likely fell into one of several categories. You might be nobility, part of the royal family or privileged class who owned the estate as a retreat. You might be a priest or priestess, serving in the religious temples that were crucial to the site's purpose. You might be a craftsperson, weaver, metalworker, ceramicist, whose skills were valuable enough to merit permanent residence. Or most likely, you were a Yanacona, a permanent servant bound to the estate, essentially a specialized form of slavery where you served the nobility for life in exchange for food, shelter, and basic necessities. The altitude alone made life at Machu Picchu physically challenging in ways that most modern visitors experience only briefly During their few hours at the site, at 7,170 feet elevation, the air contains significantly less oxygen than at sea level. If you weren't born at high altitude, acclimatization took weeks and was frequently accompanied by altitude sickness, headaches, nausea, fatigue, shortness of breath. Even for those born in the mountains, the reduced oxygen meant that physical labor was more exhausting, wounds healed more slowly, and pregnancy complications were more common. It was like living at the top of a tall building where every physical task required 30% more effort than it would at sea level. The climate was harsh and unpredictable. Machu Picchu sits in the cloud forest zone where weather changes rapidly. Mornings might be foggy and damp, afternoons sunny and hot, evenings cold and rainy. The temperature could swing 40 degrees Fahrenheit in a single day. You experienced over 60 inches of rain annually, more than Seattle, concentrated in a wet season from November to March, when landslides were common and terraces could wash away. The dry season from May to September brought cold nights where temperatures approached freezing. You needed multiple layers of clothing that you constantly adjusted throughout the day. And permanent dampness meant that mold, fungal infections, and respiratory ailments were chronic problems. Your housing depended entirely on your social status. If you were nobility, you lived in one of the finer stone buildings near the central plaza. Structures with trapezoidal doorways and windows, niches built into walls for storage or religious objects, and sometimes even a private bathroom with sophisticated drainage. These buildings showcase the famous Incan stonework with perfectly fitted blocks. But if you were a servant or agricultural worker, you likely lived in much simpler structures on the periphery. Buildings with rough stone walls, thatched roofs that leaked during heavy rains, dirt floors, and minimal ventilation. Your apartment was probably one room shared with your entire family, perhaps 10 by 12 feet, with no furniture beyond a few stone or wooden benches and sleeping mats made of woven reeds. Privacy was non-existent. Multiple families often shared a building, separated only by curtains or partial walls. You heard your neighbors' conversations, arguments, intimate moments, sickness, and childbirth. Children ran freely between households. Cooking was often communal, done in shared courtyards where everyone could see what everyone else was eating. It was like living in a dormitory where walls were thin, and personal space was a concept that didn't really exist. The water system at Machu Picchu was remarkably sophisticated, a series of stone channels and fountains that brought water from a mountain spring through the site via gravity flow. But this system served primarily the upper areas where nobility lived. If you were lower status, you might need to walk considerable distances to fetch water, carrying it in ceramic vessels back to your home. The water was clear and cold, probably the cleanest water available anywhere in the empire, but access to it reflected social hierarchy. The highest status fountain was closest to the temple area and finest residences. Lower status residents used fountains further down the system, after the water had already been accessed by those above them in social rank. Bathing was infrequent by modern standards. The cold temperatures, lack of fuel for heating water, and physical effort required to fetch and heat water meant that full body washing might happen once a week or less. You wiped yourself down with cloths, changed your outer garment occasionally, but body odor was simply normal. Everyone smelled because everyone lacked regular bathing. The constant dampness also meant that clothes never quite dried completely, developing a musty smell that was just accepted as part of life. The toilet situation reveals both Incan engineering and its limits. Some buildings, particularly those for nobility, had private bathrooms with stone channels that drained waste away from the structure. But these were exceptions. Most residents used communal latrines or designated areas at the edge of terraces where waste simply fell down the mountain. Privacy during these moments was minimal. The smell near latrine areas must have been considerable, particularly during warm weather. Intestinal parasites were common, spread through contaminated water or food fertilized with human waste. Food production at Machu Picchu was a constant challenge that defined daily life for most residents. The famous agricultural terraces that cascade down the mountainside weren't just decorative. They were essential infrastructure that made permanent habitation possible. These terraces, called andines, were marvels of engineering. Stone retaining walls filled with layers of gravel, sand, and topsoil that provided drainage and prevented erosion. But maintaining them was endless work. Every heavy rain threatened to wash away soil. Every landslide could destroy months of labor. You spent countless hours repairing terrace walls, replacing eroded soil, clearing drainage channels, and reinforcing weak points. The crops you could grow at this altitude and climate were limited. Potatoes were the staple. Dozens of varieties adapted to different microclimates and elevations. You also grew quinoa, a high-protein grain that thrived in poor soil, and various native tubers like oca, oloco. Corn grew in the lower, warmer terraces, but was less productive than at lower elevations. The agricultural calendar dominated your life. Planting in September and October, weeding and pest control during the growing season, harvest in April through June, storage and preservation for the dry season. The work of agriculture was brutally physical. You planted and harvested mostly by hand, using simple tools: a foot plow called a tackla, hoes, clubs for breaking up soil. The terraces were steep, requiring you to work at awkward angles where falling could mean serious injury. Your back ached constantly. Your hands developed thick calluses. Your knees and ankles suffered from the constant climbing and awkward positions. And all of this at altitude where you tired more easily and recovered more slowly. Crop yields were unpredictable in ways that created constant anxiety. Too much rain during a critical period could cause rot. Too little rain meant stunted crops. Early frost could destroy an entire season's planting. Pests, particularly potato weevils and moths, could decimate stored food. You never knew if this year's harvest would be sufficient or if hunger would stalk the community during the months before next harvest. It was subsistence agriculture where miscalculation or bad luck meant genuine suffering. The stored food you depended on during the dry season was kept in kolkhoz, storage buildings with sophisticated ventilation systems that kept food cool and dry. But these storage facilities were primarily for state and religious use, controlled by administrators who decided how much food each household received. You didn't store your own food. The state stored it and redistributed it according to need and status. If administrators decided your household deserved less, you went hungry. There was no appeal, no market where you could buy more, no alternative source. You were completely dependent on the state's willingness to feed you adequately. The diet, even in good times, was monotonous and often nutritionally inadequate: potatoes, quinoa, occasional corn, dried beans, sometimes chuño, freeze-dried potatoes that could store for years but tasted like cardboard. Meat was rare and precious, guinea pigs raised in homes, occasional llama or alpaca when animals were sacrificed for religious purposes, rarely wild game from hunting, fish from nearby rivers if you were lucky. Fruits and vegetables beyond potatoes were minimal. Salt was valuable and controlled by the state. Peppers provided the main flavoring. It was diet that kept you alive but rarely satisfied, where hunger was normal and fullness was exceptional. Malnutrition showed in physical ways that skeletal analysis of Machu Picchu burials reveals. Stunted growth from childhood malnutrition, dental problems from nutritional deficiencies, bone diseases that indicate vitamin D deficiency from working in perpetual cloud cover, anemia from iron-deficient diet heavy on carbohydrates and light on animal protein. Your body worked constantly at high altitude on inadequate nutrition, aging you prematurely and leaving you vulnerable to disease. Religious obligations pervaded every aspect of life at Machu Picchu. The site wasn't just a city, it was a sacred landscape where the physical and spiritual worlds intersected. The Intihuatana stone, the famous carved rock often called the hitching post of the sun, was a ritual object where ceremonies connected to the solar calendar took place. The Temple of the Sun, built around a natural rock formation, was where astronomical observations and solar worship occurred. The Temple of Three Windows had religious significance tied to Incan creation mythology. You didn't just live near these structures, you participated in ceremonies at them, ceremonies that were mandatory and time-consuming. The Incan religion demanded constant offerings and sacrifices to maintain cosmic order and ensure the prosperity of the empire and the health of the emperor. Small daily offerings, coca leaves, chicha beer made from corn, animal fat burned in braziers, were continuous. But larger ceremonies required more significant sacrifices. Llamas and alpacas were ritually killed, their blood offered to gods, their organs examined for omens, their meat distributed according to status. These ceremonies weren't rare events, but regular occurrences that structured the calendar. The most disturbing aspect of Incan religion was capacocha, human sacrifice of children selected for their physical perfection. While the most important capacocha ceremonies happened in Cusco or on high mountain peaks, Machu Picchu participated in the system that selected children, prepared them, and sometimes hosted them before their final journey. These weren't enemy captives, but children from the empire's own population, often from noble families, chosen as honor to serve as messengers to the gods. The children were fed special diets, dressed in fine textiles, given chicha beer or coca to dull their senses, and then left on mountaintops to die of exposure. The frozen mummies found on Andean peaks reveal that some children were drugged unconscious before death, a mercy of sorts, but others show signs of struggling, aware of what was happening to them. Living in a community that participated in this system of child sacrifice, even if indirectly, had to affect you psychologically. These weren't abstract religious concepts, but children you might have known, selected from communities like yours, prepared for death over weeks or months. How did you rationalize it? The Incan worldview held that the children were being honored, granted immortality as intermediaries with the gods, and that their sacrifice ensured the continued prosperity of the empire. But surely some people struggled with cognitive dissonance between these official explanations and the simple human horror of deliberately killing children. Your daily schedule began before dawn. The Incas measured time not by hours, but by the sun's position and seasonal markers. You woke when roosters crowed and the first light appeared behind the eastern mountains, perhaps 5 or 5:30 a.m. There was no sleeping in, no alarm clocks you could snooze. Your family stirred simultaneously in your one-room dwelling, everyone transitioning from sleep to wakefulness, together with no privacy. Breakfast was minimal, perhaps reheated stew from the previous night, or quinoa porridge, or simply a handful of toasted corn if food was scarce. Chicha beer was often consumed with breakfast, not to get drunk, but because fermenting corn made it easier to digest and provided some nutritional benefits. It was like coffee in modern societies, a beverage that signaled the start of the day, though with alcohol content make it unacceptable as a breakfast drink by contemporary standards. Then you went to work. If you were agricultural laborer, you climbed to the terraces and began whatever task the season demanded: planting, weeding, harvesting, terrace maintenance. If you were craftsperson, you went to your workshop and continued whatever project you were working on, weaving textiles, making ceramics, working metal. If you were priest or priestess, you prepared for the day's religious ceremonies. If you were administrator, you reviewed accounts recorded on quipus, the knotted string recording system that served as writing. Everyone worked. There was no leisure class in the sense of people who simply didn't work at all. The work was unrelenting. The Incas didn't have a weekend or regular rest days beyond major religious festivals. You worked essentially every day, all day, until the sun set and it became too dark to continue. The rhythm was determined by daylight and task completion, not by clock or predetermined schedule. In agricultural season during long summer days, you might work 12 or 13 hours. In winter, with shorter days, perhaps 8 or 9 hours. But it was always hard physical labor, with minimal breaks. Lunch came around midday. Probably a cold meal brought to your work site since returning home would waste valuable working time. More quinoa, perhaps some boiled potatoes, dried meat, if available, always chicha to drink. You ate quickly and continued working. There was no leisurely lunch hour, no designated break room, no opportunity to fully rest. You sat on a terrace wall or a rock, ate your food, and went back to work. Evening brought slight relief. You returned to your dwelling as the sun set behind the western peaks, around 6 or 6:30 p.m., depending on season. Your evening meal was the substantial meal of the day. A stew cooked in ceramic pots over a fire pit, combining potatoes, quinoa, whatever vegetables were available, occasionally meat, flavored with peppers and salt, if available. The cooking itself was time-consuming work, typically done by women, involving fetching water, gathering fuel, maintaining the fire, and preparing ingredients by hand without mechanical aids. You ate sitting on the floor or on low stone benches, using your hands or simple wooden spoons. There were no plates. You might eat directly from the cooking pot or use ceramic bowls shared by family members. Conversation during meals was probably subdued after a long day of physical labor. Children who had worked alongside adults were equally exhausted. The elderly, if they couldn't work productively anymore, were still expected to contribute what they could. Watching young children, preparing food, making simple crafts. After the evening meal, there was little time before sleep. You might repair tools, weave in dim firelight, tell stories, but more likely, you simply prepared for sleep. There was no artificial lighting beyond fire, no books to read, no entertainment options that didn't require daylight. As the fire died down and the mountain cold seeped into your dwelling, you lay down on your sleeping mat, woven reeds covered with llama or alpaca textiles, and slept the sleep of physical exhaustion until the next dawn brought another identical day. Textiles were crucial to life at Machu Picchu in ways that go far beyond simply clothing yourself. The Incas measured wealth and status largely through textiles. Fine cloth was more valuable than gold. You wore garments woven from llama or alpaca wool, spun into thread and woven on backstrap looms. The quality of your clothing immediately communicated your social status. Nobility wore fine Kumbi cloth, tightly woven fabric with intricate patterns and vibrant colors from natural dyes. Common people wore coarser Awaska cloth, functional but plain. The difference was visible from across the plaza, an immediate marker of social hierarchy that you couldn't escape or disguise. The textile work itself was primarily women's labor. Though men worked in specialized capacities, women spun thread constantly, while walking, resting, talking. The spindle and wool were always in hand, converting raw fiber into thread in every spare moment. Young girls learned to spin by age 5 or 6, their smaller fingers producing finer thread. Weaving required more concentrated effort, done on backstrap looms where one end was tied to a tree or post and the other attached to a strap around your waist. You controlled tension with your body, creating patterns through memory and skill passed down through generations. It was meditative but physically demanding work. Your back ached from hours in the same position, your fingers cramped from the repetitive motion, your eyes strained from working with fine threads and inadequate. The natural dyes used to color textiles came from a variety of sources that required specialized knowledge to extract and apply. Red, from cochineal insects that had to be collected and crushed. Blue, from indigo plants. Yellow, from various flowers and plants. Purple, from certain mollusks. Incredibly labor-intensive, since each mollusk produced only drops of dye. The dyeing process was complex, requiring mordants to fix colors, precise temperatures, and experience to achieve consistent results. A single brightly colored garment represented hundreds of hours of labor from multiple women, raising the animals, shearing, spinning, dyeing, weaving. When you saw someone wearing such a garment, you saw a fortune walking around. Your own clothing was much simpler. Men wore a simple tunic called an unku that fell to knee length, tied with a woven belt. Women wore an ankle-length dress called an anaku, held at the shoulders with decorative pins called tupus, and a large rectangular mantle that served as shawl, carrying cloth and blanket. Footwear was sandals made from woven grass or animal hide, adequate for walking, but offering minimal protection. In cold weather, you layered multiple garments and wrapped yourself in llama wool blankets, but you were often cold, particularly at night, when temperatures dropped near freezing. Even in summer months, clothing was rarely washed. Water was precious, soap was unknown, and the labor of washing and drying clothes was prohibitive. You wore the same garments continuously, changing perhaps weekly, or when clothing became so filthy, it was unbearable. The smell of unwashed wool, body odor, smoke from cooking fires, and general grime was simply normal. Everyone smelled, so no one particularly noticed. Healthcare at Machu Picchu combined practical knowledge with religious healing practices in ways that were sometimes effective and sometimes completely useless. The Incas had genuine medical knowledge. They performed trepanation, drilling holes in skulls with survival rates that modern analysis suggests exceeded 50%. Remarkable for pre-modern surgery. They understood the medicinal properties of various plants, coca leaves as stimulant and appetite suppressant, cinchona bark for fevers, various herbs for digestive complaints. They could set broken bones, stitch wounds, and treat some infections. But medical practitioners were limited in what they could actually cure. Infectious diseases, respiratory infections, gastrointestinal illnesses, parasites were common and often fatal, particularly for children and elderly. The cold, damp conditions promoted respiratory ailments. The inadequate diet weakened immune system. The lack of understanding of germ theory meant that hygiene practices didn't prevent disease transmission effectively. Infant mortality was high. Perhaps 30 or 40% of children died before age 5. Women died in childbirth regularly. Without modern obstetric knowledge, any complication could be fatal. When someone fell seriously ill, you consulted a hampik, a healer who combined herbal medicine with divination and ritual. The hampik might diagnose your illness as caused by offending a huaca, sacred place or object, possession by malevolent spirits, or witchcraft by enemies. Treatment involved herbal remedies, but also ritual purification, offerings to gods, and sometimes sacrifice of guinea pigs whose organs were examined for insights. If you recovered, the treatment was credited. If you died, it was explained as the will of gods or inadequacy of offerings. It was medical system where confirmation bias allowed practices to continue regardless of actual efficacy. Dental health was particularly poor. The Incan diet, heavy in carbohydrates, lacking in calcium, promoted cavities. The stone-ground grain that was a staple contained sand and grit from grinding stones, wearing down teeth prematurely. By age 30, you probably had significant tooth decay, abscesses, and missing teeth. There was no dentistry beyond pulling infected teeth with pliers, an agonizing procedure done without anesthesia. Many people lived with chronic dental pain that couldn't be adequately treated, alternating between infections that swelled faces grotesquely and periods of relative relief. Injuries from agricultural work and construction were common. Falls from terraces, crushing injuries from falling stones, cuts from tools, sprains and fractures from slips on wet stones. Some healed adequately. Others left you permanently impaired, a limp that never fully recovered, a hand with limited mobility, chronic pain in back or joints. If injury prevented you from working productively, your value to community diminished. There was no disability insurance, no retirement plan, no safety net beyond family willingness to share their rations. You became burden rather than contributor, your continued existence dependent on others' charity. The social hierarchy at Machu Picchu was rigid and visible. At the top were nobility, members of royal ailu, extended family group who owned the estate, visiting dignitaries from Cusco, perhaps the emperor himself on rare occasions. These individuals lived in the finest buildings, ate the best food, wore the most elaborate textiles, and did no manual labor. Their lives were devoted to religious ceremonies, administrative oversight, and enjoying the fruits of everyone else's labor. Below nobility were specialized craftspeople and administrators, weavers who made fine textiles, metal workers who created gold and silver objects for religious purposes, ceramicists who produced decorated pottery, quipu keepers who recorded accounts, priests and priestesses who conducted rituals. These individuals had some status and slightly better living conditions, but were still ultimately servants of the state. At the bottom were agricultural laborers and general servants, the Yanakona, who did the actual physical work of farming, construction, hauling water, cleaning, and maintaining the site. These people had no property, no independent source of food, no legal recourse against mistreatment. You existed to work, and your needs were met only to the extent necessary to keep you working. It was stratification that was absolute and inescapable. You were born into your social level and died in it, with essentially no social mobility except in rare cases of extraordinary service to the empire. Women's experiences at Machu Picchu were shaped by their social status, but universally subordinate to men. Noble women had more privileges than common men, but less than noble men. Common women had the hardest lives of all, combining agricultural labor with domestic work. You might work in the fields all day, then return home to prepare meals, spin thread, weave, care for children, maintain the household. Your labor was endless and uncompensated beyond basic survival rations. Some women at Machu Picchu may have been A-class, chosen women selected in childhood for their beauty and skill to serve in religious capacity. A-class lived in special compounds, wove the finest textiles for religious purposes, made chicha beer for ceremonies, and were sometimes sacrificed or given as wives to nobles. It was honor that meant permanent separation from family, celibacy, unless gifted to a man by the state, and life of cloistered service. The Virgins of the Sun, as Spanish chroniclers later called them, though the reality was more complex. Some were priestesses with high status, others were essentially high-class servants whose virginity was controlled as state property. Pregnancy and childbirth at altitude with inadequate nutrition and minimal medical care was extremely dangerous. You likely became pregnant multiple times. Contraception was limited, and birth spacing happened mostly through lactation and high rates of miscarriage. Each pregnancy risked your life. Maternal mortality rates were substantial. Perhaps 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 births resulted in the mother's death. If you survived childbirth, you immediately returned to work, probably within days, since your labor was too essential to spare. The infant came with you to the fields, carried in a shawl, nursing while you worked, sleeping in shade while you tended crops. Children were expected to work from early ages. By 5 or 6, they were herding llamas, scaring birds from crops, carrying water, learning crafts from adults. There was no childhood as modern society conceives it, no school, no dedicated playtime, no sheltering from adult responsibilities. Children were workers in training, valued for their future productivity rather than protected for their innocence. Mortality was high enough that emotional attachment to young children was probably somewhat guarded. You couldn't invest fully in children who had perhaps 60% chance of reaching adulthood. Your connection to the wider Incan Empire was constant, despite Machu Picchu's remote location. The site was connected to the vast Incan road network, the Capacñan, that stretched over 25,000 miles across the empire. Messengers called chasqui ran these roads in relay fashion, carrying messages tied in quipus and delivering them with impressive speed. A message could travel from Cusco to the coast, several hundred miles, in a few days, faster than mail delivery in many parts of the world until the railroad age. But for you as an ordinary resident, the road system meant less communication and more control. The roads allowed the empire to extract resources efficiently, move armies quickly to suppress rebellions, and relocate populations when convenient for the state. The same infrastructure that enabled trade and communication also enabled systematic exploitation and rapid repression of resistance. It was technological achievement that served primarily to strengthen imperial control over subjects who had no say in governance. Tribute flowed constantly from Machu Picchu to Cusco. The finest textiles produced by weavers, gold and silver objects crafted by metalworkers, ceramics with artistic merit, even people. Young men drafted for military service, young women selected as a class, specialists whose skills were needed elsewhere. The empire took what it wanted and left you with bare minimum for survival. It was extractive colonial relationship, where the productive capacity of the site benefited primarily the rulers who controlled it, not the workers who created the wealth. The isolation of Machu Picchu had both advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, remoteness provided some protection from certain diseases that ravaged lowland populations. The cool mountain climate discouraged some parasites and disease vectors common at lower elevations. The small population size meant epidemics that swept through larger cities might not reach you or might burn out quickly. On the other hand, isolation meant that when disaster struck, help was far away and slow to arrive. If a landslide destroyed terraces, you couldn't quickly import food. You starved until next harvest, or until supplies could be carried up steep mountain paths. If an epidemic did reach you, there were no specialists to consult, no alternative medicines to try, no hospital to evacuate to. You were on your own with whatever resources existed on site. The psychological impact of living in such a restricted environment, beautiful but constrained, must have been significant. You saw the same faces every day, walked the same path, performed the same tasks in the same locations. There was no travel unless the empire ordered you elsewhere, no change of scenery except seasonal variations, no new experiences beyond births, deaths, and religious festivals. It was life of profound monotony, broken only by hard work and occasional ceremony. The spiritual significance of the landscape provided some meaning and connection to the cosmic order. The mountains surrounding Machu Picchu weren't just geography, they were apus, mountain gods who required respect and offerings. Huayna Picchu, the distinctive peak that rises behind the ruins in photographs, was sacred mountain requiring ritual approach. The Urubamba River far below in the valley was associated with the Milky Way, creating link between terrestrial and celestial realms. Living within this sacred landscape meant your daily life had cosmic significance. Your work maintained not just a city, but a microcosm of divine order. But this spiritual meaning came with burden of constant religious obligation. You couldn't simply admire the mountains aesthetically. You had to perform the correct rituals, make the appropriate offerings, respect the elaborate system of religious obligations that governed interaction with sacred landscape. Failure to do so properly could bring disaster on an entire community. It was like living in cathedral, where every action had moral weight and casual behavior was transgression. The abandonment of Machu Picchu remains somewhat mysterious, but likely relates to the Spanish conquest of the Incan Empire. When Francisco Pizarro captured the Incan Emperor Atahualpa in 1532 and executed him the following year, the empire rapidly collapsed. The civil war that preceded Spanish arrival had already weakened the empire. two brothers fighting for control after their father's death, each with armies and supporters. The Spanish arrival during this vulnerability allowed a force of perhaps 200 conquistadors to topple an empire of millions. Machu Picchu may have been abandoned before Spanish arrival or shortly after. The site's remoteness meant it wasn't immediately valuable to Spanish interests. They wanted gold, silver, and access to populations they could exploit for labor in mines and plantations. A royal estate in the mountains without obvious mineral wealth wasn't priority. The population may have fled as the imperial structure collapsed, migrating to other areas in confusion and disorder that accompany conquest. Or they may have been forcibly relocated by Spanish administrators consolidating populations for easier control and conversion to Christianity. What's remarkable is that Machu Picchu wasn't destroyed the way many Incan sites were. Spanish chroniclers don't mention it, suggesting they never knew it existed or considered it significant enough to populations knew of the ruins but didn't direct Spanish attention there. The site was gradually reclaimed by jungle, stone walls embraced by tree roots, terraces becoming forested slopes, buildings filled with vegetation. It wasn't hidden deliberately so much as simply forgotten as empire that built it ceased to exist and priorities of new colonial system directed attention elsewhere. For about 400 years, Machu Picchu sat abandoned and largely unknown to the world beyond local farmers who occasionally used the terraces. The stones remained, but the life that animated them vanished. No more ceremonies at the Intihuatana, no more children playing in the plazas, no more smoke rising from cooking fires, no more weavers spinning thread while gossiping with neighbors. The city died not with dramatic destruction, but with quiet abandonment, population trickling away until one day no one returned and the jungle began its slow reconquest. Hiram Bingham's discovery of Machu Picchu in 1911 was actually a rediscovery. He was led to the site by a local farmer who knew the ruins were there. Bingham was American historian seeking Vilcabamba, the last stronghold of Incan resistance to Spanish conquest. He thought he'd found it at Machu Picchu, though he was wrong. Vilcabamba was elsewhere. But his photographs and descriptions brought international attention to the ruins, beginning transformation from abandoned city to archaeological site to tourist destination. The irony is that Machu Picchu's fame today comes from being abandoned. If it had remained inhabited and important, Spanish would have found it, probably destroyed temples to build churches, reorganized the city to Spanish colonial patterns, and modernized it until the Incan structures were largely obliterated or built over. The site we admire today exists because it wasn't valuable enough to destroy or build upon. Its preservation is accident of abandonment, not testament to anyone's desire to preserve it. Understanding Machu Picchu requires understanding its place within the Incan Empire, which at its height was the largest empire in pre-Columbian Americas, stretching from modern Ecuador through Peru and Bolivia into Chile and Argentina. This empire, Tawantinsuyu, land of four quarters, was relatively short-lived. The Incas only achieved imperial dominance in the 15th century, less than 100 years before Spanish conquest ended their rule. It was empire that rose spectacularly and fell catastrophically within roughly a century. The rapid expansion created constant need for labor to build and maintain imperial infrastructure, roads, temples, agricultural terraces, storage facilities, military installations, administrative centers. Machu Picchu was one piece in vast network of royal estates, religious sites, and administrative centers that required continuous maintenance and staffing. The MITA system that brought you to Machu Picchu was applied across the empire, mobilizing perhaps a third of all adult males at any given time for state labor projects. It was mobilization of human resources on scale comparable to wartime draft, but applied continuously during peacetime. The Incan approach to conquered peoples was sophisticated in its brutality. Rather than simply extracting tribute, they systematically restructured conquered societies. Local leaders who cooperated were incorporated into imperial hierarchy and rewarded with privileges. Rebellious populations were relocated wholesale. Thousands of families moved hundreds of miles to regions where they had no local connections and couldn't easily organize. This practice, called metama, broke up potential resistance while simultaneously colonizing recently conquered territories, with populations loyal to the empire. It was ethnic engineering that destroyed local cultures and replaced them with Incan imperial culture. The official language of the empire was Quechua, which was imposed on conquered peoples as administrative language regardless of their native tongue. Local languages were discouraged or prohibited. Children were taught Quechua in addition to or instead of their ancestral languages. It was cultural imperialism that systematically erased linguistic diversity in favor of unified imperial culture. The success of this policy is evident in that Quechua remains widely spoken in Andes today, while many pre-Incan languages disappeared completely. The comparison with other ancient civilizations reveals both similarities and distinctive features. Like Rome, the Incas built roads and moved armies rapidly to maintain control. Like Egypt, they mobilized vast labor forces for monumental construction projects. Like China, they maintained detailed administrative records, though using quipus rather than writing. But the Incas achieved this without several technologies that other civilizations considered essential. No writing system meant all record-keeping and message transmission relied on quipus, knotted strings where knots of different types, positions, and colors encoded numerical and possibly linguistic information that quipu keepers could read, but that modern scholars still don't fully understand. The absence of the wheel is particularly striking. The Incas understood the principle. Children's toys with wheels have been found in archaeological sites, but they never developed wheeled vehicles for transport, perhaps because the mountainous terrain made wheels impractical, or because llamas and human porters were adequate for their needs, or because the social system that provided unlimited human labor made technological innovation unnecessary. It was choice, conscious or unconscious, that prioritized labor mobilization over labor-saving technology. The absence of iron tools meant all metalworking, stoneworking, and construction used bronze, stone, and wood tools. The precision stonework that amazes modern visitors was achieved through patient grinding. Softer stones used to shape harder stones. Bronze tools to make detailed cuts. Sand as abrasive, and primarily time and labor. A single precisely fitted stone might represent weeks or months of work by skilled masons. When you have unlimited labor available through MITA system, time is less constraining factor than it would be in society where labor is compensated and expensive. The archaeological evidence from Machu Picchu reveals details of daily life that documents don't. Skeletal remains show patterns of injury and disease, compression fractures in spines from carrying heavy loads, arthritis in joints from repetitive motion, dental problems from nutritional deficiencies, stunted growth from childhood malnutrition, skull deformations from cranial binding practiced on high-status children. These bones tell stories of individual suffering that statistics can't capture. The ceramics found at the site reveal social stratification. Fine Cusco polychrome pottery in noble quarters, carefully decorated vessels with standardized patterns that marked imperial style, cruder local pottery in servant areas, functional but plain, made quickly and used until broken. The food remains show what different social classes ate, nobles consuming meat regularly, servants rarely. The distribution of coca leaves, found primarily in elite contexts, suggests this valued stimulant was controlled and distributed according to status. The discovery of arabalos, large jar with pointed bottom used for storing and transporting chicha beer, in nearly every residential structure suggests chicha consumption was indeed universal, not limited to ceremonial contexts. The fermented corn beer provided calories, was safer than water in many cases, and was so central to Incan culture that withholding it would have been unthinkable. It was beverage that lubricated social interactions, sealed agreements, honored gods, and provided daily nutrition. Textile fragments preserved in dry burial contexts reveal incredible skill. Some fabrics have thread counts exceeding 200 threads per inch, finer than many modern fabrics achieved entirely by hand without mechanical aids. The dyes remain vibrant after centuries, testament to sophisticated chemistry. But these masterpieces of textile art were produced by women working endless hours in dim light, their fingers cramped from fine work, their backs aching from bent posture, their eyes straining. Beauty was extracted from human labor, measured not in hours, but in years of continuous production. The agricultural terraces themselves are subject of ongoing study. Modern engineers analyzing their construction have found sophisticated features: gravel drainage layers that prevent waterlogging, stone retaining walls that dissipate seismic energy during earthquakes, soil mixtures optimized for different crops at different elevations. But this engineering knowledge wasn't written down. It was transmitted orally through master builders who learned through years of apprenticeship. When Spanish conquest killed or dispersed these specialists, much of this knowledge was lost. Some terrace systems throughout Andes fell into disrepair because no one remaining knew how to maintain them properly. Recent studies, using ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies, have revealed that Machu Picchu may have been larger than previously thought, with additional structures still hidden under jungle vegetation. Each discovery adds to our understanding, but also reminds us how much remains unknown. We can measure stones, analyze pottery, study bones, but we can't fully reconstruct interior lives of people who left no written records of their thoughts, dreams, fears, and hopes. The question of why Machu Picchu was built continues to generate scholarly debate. Was it primarily royal estate and vacation retreat for Emperor Pachacuti? Was it sacred site with astronomical significance? Was it administrative center controlling access to jungle regions below? Was it combination of all these functions? The absence of written records means we reconstruct purpose from physical evidence and later Spanish accounts of Incan society generally. not from documents explaining this specific site's function. It's like trying to understand modern cities' purpose by examining buildings alone without any texts, conversations, or records of what happened in them. What we can say with confidence is that Machu Picchu required enormous investment of labor to build and maintain. Hundreds of workers must have lived there continuously just to farm the terraces, maintain buildings, serve religious functions, and provide for needs of any nobles in residence. The cost-benefit analysis from imperial perspective must have favored this investment, whether for religious, political, economic, or status reasons. From perspective of workers who provided the labor, there was no analysis. You went where empire sent you and did what empire demanded. The broader lesson about civilization and its costs is sobering. We can create beauty and achieve remarkable feats of engineering, but throughout history, these achievements have often been built on exploitation of those with no power to refuse. The pyramids of Egypt, the Great Wall of China, the Colosseum in Rome, the Taj Mahal in India, and countless other wonders were built by forced labor of various kinds, slaves, corvée workers, conscripts, prisoners. Machu Picchu fits this pattern. Spectacular achievement made possible by a system that valued collective accomplishment over individual well-being. Modern tourism to Machu Picchu generates enormous revenue for Peru and provides livelihoods for thousands of people working in tourism industry. In some sense, the site continues to serve economic function, though radically different from original purpose. Visitors spend money to see ruins, supporting modern economy in ways that indirectly benefit descendants of people who might have worked at the site centuries ago. But this economic benefit comes with costs. Environmental impact from millions of annual visitors, erosion from foot traffic, pressure on infrastructure, tension between preservation and access. The debates about how to manage Machu Picchu as UNESCO World Heritage Site mirror broader questions about how we relate to past. Should site be preserved in current state, even if that means limiting access? Should restoration work attempt to rebuild portions that have collapsed, even if that means adding modern materials? Should we try to recreate aspects of Incan life for visitors, even if those recreations are necessarily speculative and potentially misleading? These questions don't have clear answers. They involve trade-offs between competing values of preservation, access, education, and economic benefit. What remains undeniable is that real people lived real lives at Machu Picchu under conditions that were simultaneously spectacular and brutal. They woke to mountain sunrises that still take your breath away. They worked terraces that still cascade down the mountainside in geometric precision. They participated in ceremonies at temples that still align with solstices and equinoxes. But they also endured cold, hunger, exhaustion, disease, and complete lack of freedom. They created something that endures centuries after their deaths, but that creation was compelled rather than freely chosen, and the glory we attribute to it came at cost they paid with their bodies, health, and lives. The romanticization of Machu Picchu in popular culture as mystical place of harmony with nature, spiritual enlightenment, and superior ecological practices obscures these realities. Yes, the Incas developed sustainable agricultural techniques that worked with, rather than against, the mountain environment. Yes, they created aesthetic beauty in their architecture and crafts. Yes, they organized complex society that functioned effectively for their purposes. But sustainability was achieved through human labor that wore bodies down by age 40. Beauty was created by craftspeople who had no choice but to create it. Social organization functioned by denying most people any voice in how society was organized. The modern visitor standing at the sun gate watching dawn illuminate the ruins experiences something genuinely moving. Connection to human achievement across centuries, appreciation for perseverance and ingenuity of people who built under impossible conditions, wonder at beauty of natural and constructed landscape. These feelings are real and valid, but they're incomplete if they don't also include recognition of human cost. The worker who died when stone fell during construction, the child sacrificed in Capacocha ceremony, the woman who survived childbirth only to return immediately to field labor, the man whose midday service took him from family and community he never saw again. History is not morality play with clear heroes and villains. The Incas were neither noble savages living in harmony with nature nor brutally oppressive empire comparable to worst modern totalitarian states. They were complex civilization that achieved remarkable things through methods we now recognize as exploitative, motivated by values we may not share, operating under constraints we don't face. We can simultaneously acknowledge their achievements and recognize their injustices, appreciate their ingenuity, and critique their systems, study their society, and be grateful we don't live in it. For the person who lived at Machu Picchu, whose name we'll never know, whose individual story is lost to time, who was born, worked, loved, suffered, and died in the city in the clouds, these abstract historical evaluations would be meaningless. You didn't ask to be born into Incan society or to be sent to Machu Picchu. You didn't choose the religious beliefs you were taught or the social system you inhabited. You simply lived the life circumstances gave you, making what small choices you could, finding what meaning and connection you could, and enduring what you had to endure. Your individual humanity deserves recognition, even as we study the civilization that shaped your existence. Modern visitors to Machu Picchu see spectacular ruins in dramatic setting and imagine spiritual sanctuary, architectural triumph, mysterious lost civilization. They don't see the cold nights, the endless agricultural labor, the chronic hunger, the children dying of preventable diseases, the mandatory religious ceremonies demanding human sacrifice, the rigid social hierarchy where most people were essentially servants, the complete lack of freedom or self-determination. They see stones fitting together perfectly and marvel at engineering without considering the forced labor that quarried, shaped, and hauled those stones. They see terraces cascading down mountainsides and admire ingenuity without imagining the exhausting work of planting, maintaining, and harvesting on those steep slopes. This romanticization of Machu Picchu reflects broader pattern in how we think about past. We abstract beauty and achievement from the human cost that we admire them. Outcomes without deeply considering process. We project our own values and desires onto cultures that operated on completely different assumptions about power, individual rights, and social organization. Machu Picchu becomes screen onto which we project fantasies of simpler, more spiritual, more connected to nature way of life, when reality was far more complicated, brutal, and constrained. The Incas created remarkable civilization that achieved extraordinary things without writing, without the wheel, without iron tools, without draft animals beyond llamas that could carry perhaps 50 pounds. They built roads across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. They organized empire of perhaps 10 million people with sophisticated They developed agricultural techniques that allowed farming at altitudes where most crops won't grow. They created art, architecture, and textiles of stunning beauty and technical sophistication. These achievements deserve recognition and respect. But these achievements came at cost paid primarily by people who had no choice in the matter. The Mita labor system was slavery by another name. The rigid social hierarchy denied most people any opportunity for advancement. The religious system demanded human sacrifice. The political system was authoritarian empire, where subjects had no voice in governance, no right to refuse labor demands, no legal protections against abuse by those above them. It was civilization built on exploitation, however sophisticated its achievements. The question modern people often ask, whether we should admire the Incas despite their practices we find morally problematic, misses the point. We can simultaneously acknowledge extraordinary achievements and recognize brutal systems that enable them. We can appreciate artistry of textiles without romanticizing labor conditions of weavers. We can be awed by engineering of terraces without forgetting workers who maintain them. We can study Incan society as complex civilization worthy of understanding while being honest about human cost of its grandeur. For you, living in Machu Picchu, these abstract considerations would have been irrelevant. You didn't choose to be there. You didn't necessarily believe your life had cosmic significance. You might have been a true believer in Incan religion and social order, or you might have been a skeptic who kept doubts carefully hidden, or more likely something in between. You got up each day, did the work required of you, ate the food provided, participated in the ceremonies mandated, raised your children as best you could, and hoped to avoid disasters both personal and communal. You lived a life constrained by circumstances completely beyond your control, making what small choices you could within system that determined nearly everything about your existence. So, the next time you see photographs of Machu Picchu, the perfectly fitted stones, the dramatic mountain backdrop, the terraces descending into mist, remember the reality behind the beauty. Remember the person who hauled water uphill every day, who worked terraces until their back permanently ached, who lost children to malnutrition and disease, who participated in religious ceremonies that sometimes involved child sacrifice, who had no freedom to leave or change their circumstances, who lived and died at the whim of empire that valued their labor but not their well-being. Life in ancient Machu Picchu wasn't an adventure in spiritual paradise. It was existence of hard physical labor at altitude with inadequate nutrition, constant religious obligations with real human cost, and complete subordination to social system that denied individual agency. The courage and resilience of people who lived there was real. You don't survive those conditions without remarkable strength, but that courage was extracted through circumstances of exploitation, not freely chosen hardship undertaken transcendent purpose. And that's the real story of Machu Picchu, not mystical lost city in the clouds, but community of real people making the best of difficult circumstances in beautiful but demanding environment, building something remarkable not because they wanted to create wonder of the world, but because they had no choice except to build what empire demanded. The stones remain, testament to their labor. But the people who placed them, sweated over them, lived among them, they're gone, leaving only bones that archaeologists study and stories we try to reconstruct from fragmentary evidence, and so ends our journey through life in ancient Machu Picchu. If you enjoyed this exploration of reality behind the romance, subscribe for more journeys revealing historical truths. Leave a comment telling me which aspect of Machu Picchu life surprised you most, or suggest another historical topic you'd like me to explore. Sleep well, time traveler, and maybe tonight, appreciate that your labor is compensated. Your choices are mostly your own. Your children receive medical care and education, and your life's meaning isn't dictated by empire that views you as resource to be extracted. Appreciate that you can visit beautiful places without being forced to live and work in them until your body breaks down. Appreciate that history is full of people who built amazing things under terrible conditions, and that we honor them best not by romanticizing their suffering, but by being honest about what their lives actually involved. Sweet dreams.